So let's look at how we might do some S planning when using the spine materials. Let's take the example of Year 3, Block 117, Composition and Calculation. It's the first block in Year 3 that we'll use. We can apply the same strategies to every block. We could read through the whole block, all the teaching points, or we could read just teaching point 1. It's a good idea to skim read through the whole block early on, but when we get down to actually planning, just read the next teaching point or two. As we read through, we might consider what the key points of the progression are. Having read through the teaching point, this is the general progression of the concepts in that block. The spine materials are notes about pedagogy and didactics, not a scheme. They unpick what we know about how children learn concepts and suggest ideas about how we might make that learning more effective for them. The main mistake that people make when using them is to follow them like a scheme, to do every activity suggested, use every representation, and to record in the books for every single idea. Rather than spending time highlighting all of the different activities and small points, it might be better to just read it, have a cup of tea to digest it a bit, consider what the golden thread of that part of the teaching is, what's the story of this block, read it again and jot down a few key points onto an S, and then put it away and do the planning for your class. Or you might just have it to the side to remind yourself of a few ideas. Just don't follow it like a scheme. So step 1, jot down a few important ideas onto an S. Just do that backward S. Think about the few key ideas that we got from having a bit of a read through and jot them down onto a continuous ribbon. So consider here whether you need to record something for each of the ideas or not. You could think about that at this point and write questions for the whole S, or do it as you teach each point. It doesn't matter. I like to think of questions from the whole S. Then, if I move more quickly through a piece of learning, I have them to use. Whether it's at the end of a lesson, in the middle of a lesson, or at the beginning of a lesson, they're there ready for me to use. You might, at this point, think of a hook question for each of most of the teaching points. Simply recording some questions in a book doesn't mean to say that the concept has been learned. It's much better to record less often, but with questions that are progressive. For instance, if we give 3 questions, each one should assess a different aspect, context or use of the concept and reveal a deeper understanding. Not just filling in the missing numbers, although that's important, but assessing whether the children have really understood it to depth, and some to greater depth than is expected of the year group. And remember that the questions don't have to be made on a computer or be lovely to look at or be coloured or have nice pictures on, although the handwriting in my jottings here is pretty bad. Some schools might insist on them being made on a computer, but we might question whether that's focused on learning and whether pictures or colour on questions is actually presenting extraneous cognitive load. So they don't have to look pretty, they have to look neat and tidy. The children have to be able to read them and work with them, but they don't have to be done on a computer. For instance, I think that if children can answer 3 of these 4 questions correctly after doing some of the learning at the beginning of the S, I would consider that they've definitely understood to a good level of depth, and we should probably move on. And in the spine materials, there are some obvious questions which fit with particular concepts. And some scheme materials might have questions that fit exactly where your children are on the concept. So there are really good questions in White Rose, and you could pick from some of those, not necessarily use them in the way that they say to use them, but where they fit in your run of ideas that are really useful for telling you how well the children have understood the concept that you've been teaching them. Gareth Metcalfe's materials are often good for determining how well children can reason about a concept. So if there are not enough questions for you to decide to move on and to tell you how well they've understood a concept, bring some other questions in there. Gareth Metcalfe's White Rose are absolutely fine to use. You might think about spinning the question in different ways yourself, using the spinning document to support you. Thinking about the questions that will tell you if the concept has been learned to reasonable depth is best done collaboratively within the year group. It doesn't take very long to just look at the S and then think about some different questions between you collaboratively. In fact, making S plans for a year group is best done collaboratively rather than one person working on them on their own. Next, you might start adding some pedagogic and didactic notes for each of the key teaching points. What will be important to do? What might the hook be? What are the common difficulty points or misconceptions? You can see that here I've highlighted that children may think that in 100 there is 100 and no tens or ones. But of course there are 100 ones and 10 tens, so I'll need to highlight that there are no additional tens, etc. This is a common difficulty point. And here I've decided to make sure that I've highlighted the stem sentence that I think is important. And here I've highlighted the representations that I might use. The short phrases that I've written here might not mean much to you, for instance, no additional 10, but they've meaning for me, and this is my planning. Your little phrases, etc., and things that you write down only need to make sense to you. Here I've highlighted to remind myself to look at the composition of 100 both additively and multiplicatively. So now I've done that all the way through, thinking about which representations I'm going to use. Not every one of the ones suggested in the block, the ones I think that will be useful. Here I've used the number line, Dean's blocks and the bar model, a range of representations. I've highlighted that towards the end of the S, I'll just use the questions that are in the spine materials, so I haven't got to make any of my own. Often in these spine materials, it seems like a good idea to do less recording and concentrate on unpicking the ideas practically and orally, developing dialogue across the class, mathematical reasoning, at the beginning, and to record more towards the end with less practical and oral exploration. So, having given some questions, perhaps without much extra input, you might need to plan in some questions to explore in class as feedback from their recording, working from the common difficulty points that they have. You might like to mark places where you're going to have a greater concentration on oracy, where children are questioning each other and unpicking each other's ideas, or feedback, or developing metacognition by modelling it to a greater degree. We know that all three of these are really important to develop deeper learning, so we might plan them onto our S plan. SEND, EAL, stretching individuals, spending more time on an aspect, reminding yourself about cognitive load, showing where you might spend some more time on developing metacognition, focusing on a particular type of feedback, etc., etc. This is where the S plan can really fit to your own group of learners. We agree with the NCETM about the importance of the 5 aspects of pedagogy. The spine materials have 4 of these: representations, fluency, variation and coherence built in. Schemes don't, and so you need to spend time on them to build them in when you're S-planning using a scheme. As well as these 4 aspects of pedagogy, we need to make sure that we plan in that 5th one, mathematical thinking or oracy. We also need to make sure that important things such as metacognition and effective feedback are planned in, as well as key points for our own class. It can be tempting to put loads onto your S plan. Resist. Get a balance of what's important and making it usable on your plan. The S will be your plan to add to, cross out, change as lessons progress. Once again, don't make it on a computer. Use a big sheet of paper and only use different colours if that helps you. Resist the idea of planning it like this and then transferring it onto a planning sheet with 15 boxes. The actual progression of the lesson might go like this: 1 small step completed in each lesson exactly how you wrote it on the S. But it's very unlikely to, and we shouldn't expect it to. It doesn't matter if it doesn't. Or they might go through it more confidently, perhaps completing 1.5 of the points in a lesson, or perhaps only half of one of the points. One of the best things about S planning is it doesn't matter if they don't end or start at one of the points. If you get halfway through a point in one lesson, recapping it in the next is spaced practice. You're always prepared for the next few steps on. Similarly, if you start to explain a new concept just at the end of a lesson and have to reintroduce it at the beginning of the next, so you might get part of the way around your S in between 2 points and then it's the end of the lesson. So you've started to explain an idea and then we have to go out to break. It doesn't matter, because when you reintroduce it at the beginning of the next lesson, it's retrieval practice, connecting with ideas that you previously taught to retrieve that information from the long-term memory. It's good practice. Okay, so thanks for watching this presentation. Members of the maths team are available from now on to help you practically make an S plan for some real planning for your class to get you started. Just get in touch with us.